at ya, at ya. Tell you what's master, coming at ya, coming at ya. Rhyme style disaster, coming at ya, at ya. Tell you what's master.
All right, welcome back to another episode of the Cut the Bull podcast. I am Wilfred Reilly. This is what a feminist looks like. And I am here today with my talented and lovely co-host, Christy Kelly, as always. Brooks Crenshaw, also lovely and talented. And today we're bringing on someone who needs no introduction, but will receive one, Jason Riley, Manhattan Institute. Most of you that are in an audience for this kind of content are very familiar with his work. He wrote Maverick, probably the best biography I've read of Thomas Sowell. He wrote The Black Boom, or took on the cat herding editing chore there. I contributed to that volume. So did a number of other Black conservatives, business people. The final collection of essays quite good. He also wrote, I will note, the book Please Stop Helping Us, which is a book that I read as kind of a young business type in grad school that actually inspired some decisions I made in my life. Do you really need the government in Black communities or working class communities to the extent that we've had it there? And today you are here, Jason, to talk about your latest book, which is the Affirmative Action Myth, if I have the title correct.
Yes.
Okay, so I guess I'm actually fairly famous, according to our comment section, for opening with some weak softball question. So here goes one. What is the affirmative action myth, Jason? What do you mean by that?
Well, thank you for having me on, Wilfred. I appreciate the invitation. The affirmative action myth, in a nutshell, is that Black Americans need racial preferences to get ahead, for upward mobility, and that without special treatment from the government, Blacks will not be able to succeed in this country. And that is the myth I am taking on in the book. And what prompted that idea was the debate surrounding the Supreme Court decision in Harvard versus Students for Fair Admissions back in 2023, which banned racial preferences in higher education, particularly in college admissions. And I was listening to some of the chatter right around the time of that decision. And the decision itself wasn't particularly surprising. You know, people who follow the court looked at the makeup of the Supreme Court at the time and said, well, you know, these policies, their days are probably numbered here. But I was struck by some of the commentary coming out of elite circles, including Black elites in politics, in the media, and so forth, who there was this apocalyptic rhetoric, this doomsaying. Oh my goodness, if these policies go away, college campuses will be whitewashed. Black upward mobility will be no more. You know, these policies created the Black middle class, and without these policies, there will be no more Black middle class. And I sort of wanted to say, wait a minute, let's look at the track record here. There was a Black middle class in place well before these policies were put in place in the late 60s and early 70s, and it was growing at a particularly good clip. If anything, that upward mobility slowed, if not stalled, and in some cases reversed course after these policies were put in place. So that was another impetus for writing the book.
Okay. And I think I'm going to move to the rest of the panel almost now. Well, yeah, let's just see what questions other people have. Brooks Crenshaw, what do you think about this? Any questions about the what's your first query for Jason?
Yeah, so I'd just like to kind of piggyback on this discussion. You know, the law has been flouted regarding Title VII for decades, but in the wake of the court case that you just mentioned and Ames versus Ohio, it appears as though these are Title VII infractions now definitively. Do you believe that we're making the case that, companies and universities are now legally exposed? Do you believe that's the case, or do you think that this will continue to go on even in spite of the SCOTUS decision?
Well, I believe they have been exposed, and yes, I believe they will. There will be attempts to continue with these programs. I liken it to what happened after the Brown versus Board of Education decision back in 1954. It's not as if the Southern segregationists threw up their hands and said, "Oh well, we lost at the Supreme Court level. I guess we will have to desegregate." No, they resisted. They resisted for decades. And it took a number of follow-up lawsuits and legal actions and persistence on the on the part of proponents of desegregation to make their case. And I don't think that this situation will be any different. You have a group of people on the left that are really dug in terms of promoting racial preferences. And what they have in common, I think, with the Southern segregationists of yesteryear is an opposition to color blindness. Both of these groups oppose color-blind policies. The Southern segregationists did not like it back in the 50s. The progressives do not like it today. Color-blind is a dirty word on the left today. You use it at your discretion. You use it knowing that you are going to have some pushback. There have been a number of books with it in the title. People that your audience may be familiar with, people like Holman Hughes, have written books about this and written extensively about color blindness and that being the primary goal of the original civil rights movement, but that rhetoric has fallen out of favor today. And so I suspect that we will continue to see pushback against the Supreme Court ruling. And what it will take is that the proponents of color blindness will have to continue to pursue these policies. There'll have to be follow-up lawsuits. There'll have to be follow-up court action. And that's what we see so far. The same group that brought the case against Harvard and the University of North Carolina, Students for Fair Admissions, Edward Bloom, is on the case. He is doing a good job of following up. And we've seen the ramifications not only on campus, you mentioned the workplace, but also off campus. Companies being sued, nonprofits being sued, philanthropies being, the Gates Foundation, for example, being sued. So yeah, there's going to be a need for follow-up on this, and I don't think they're going to give up.
Interesting. I mean, the comparison there of what's going on now to Southern segregationism is actually interesting. I hadn't thought that. I would imagine a lot of Caucasian and Asian friends watching the podcast will, wondering if people are going to try to insist on keeping some kind of tricksy policy in place for the next. When did Alabama actually desegregate? 1968 or something like that? 71?
Probably much later. Probably, in Boston with the busing decisions, that went well into the 80s and 90s and beyond. These all date to Brown versus Board of Education, but the pushback has been there for decades. So no, I don't expect the other side to give up easily. And so much has been invested in racial preferences. Today it goes by DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion and so forth, or multiculturalism, but it's all the same thing. It's all the same songbook here. And there is a lot invested in these policies. The University of Michigan, which made some news a few months ago because after the decision, it rolled back some of its DEI policies. But over the past 10 years, Wilfred, the University of Michigan had spent $250 million on DEI policies, more than any large public university in the country. Hundreds of people had been hired. They were hugely invested in this. And by the way, by their own admission, it didn't work. Race relations on campus had worsened over the past 10 years. By their own reckoning, they had worsened. But my point is that people are dug in, and they're dug in not only at the college level, but they're also dug in at the K through 12 level. What you're seeing, these programs, whether they're schools that you need to test into, like some of these in New York City, we have several schools where a single standardized test determines who is admitted. But other states have schools like this as well. A lot of states have gifted and talented programs. again, that are under attack because of the lack of racial balance and who is admitted to these programs and so forth. So this is not going to end. You're going to have people pushing it both at the college level, but also at the K through 12 level.
Oh, Christy Kelly, I mean, you've been waiting patiently through this initial
Mhm.
conversation. Do you have a question about affirmative action and how that'll continue, or something else about the black middle class? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on this, but initially I did want to comment on the whole DEI because what we've seen is them just rewriting descriptions, right? We've seen whole pages come down and then them just rewriting the person's job description in a kind of way to kind of fool or, kind of keep the DEI policy in place, but, kind of fool people into thinking that it's not there. So I think we are going to have an uphill stream trying to get rid of it because they'll just go another way. I know here, I'm in Arizona, and I think I shared with the panel before. I was astonished. I mean, I have a sophomore in college now, and when she got ready to apply for the schools here locally, they have just done away with the SAT test altogether. Not only have they done away with standardized tests, they've done away with letter of recommendations. I'm like, what are they judging people on now? So I'm wondering if some of the more elite schools will just start going. I mean, though it's across the board in Arizona. You do not have to take a standardized test to get into any of the schools here. So I'm wondering if some of the more elite schools elsewhere will start doing that just to get over this, racial preferences. And then they'll do things like, name, or I think I heard you say in one interview, we'll read your application on video. So then they'll, be able to give preferences that way.
Sure. They've already started to go with the test optional path. A lot of this started under COVID, when you could argue there was a legitimate reason to do that because of the social distancing. Kids couldn't be gathered to take the test and so forth. But a lot of schools have reverted and gone back to using the test. I'm glad that has happened. This attack on standardized testing, I think, is so misguided. A test is telling you where a kid is. A test isn't telling you this idea. It's like a thermometer. You give the kid a thermometer. You take the temperature, and if the temperature is above average, you don't blame the thermometer. If you give a kid a test and the kid doesn't score well on the test, the problem is not the test. The problem is how well prepared that child has been for the test. And if we want to help these kids, we need to know where they are, not where we hope they are or where we wish they are, but where they actually are. And because they can only get where we want them to go from where they are. And to the extent that you are taking away the test, you are taking away a measure of where that child is right now, so that we can help them get where we want them to be eventually. And so I think this attack on testing is extremely misguided. The other irony of the attack on testing, particularly from the sort of woke left who sees racism around every corner, is that the test is an objective measure. And the reason we have standardized tests is because of how other ethnic minorities were treated in the past when they were subjected to more subjective analysis of who should get into a school. So Jews were told 100 years ago, oh, yeah, you test well, but you're just not the Harvard type. You don't have the right personality, the right social skills, or so forth, and so we're going to exclude you. And that led to standardized testing for college admissions so that a parent or a student could say, hey, I met your credentials. I have the GPA, I have the class rank, I have the test scores. Don't tell me I don't have the right personality for this school. We're not going by these subjective measures anymore. So it's sort of ironic that today people who see racism everywhere want to eliminate objective standards for determining who should get in to some of these elite schools. And I take issue with that.
Now, I do have one follow-up question because if you take a liberal, most likely what they'll say is no one hardly takes these tests in a vacuum. Especially, I know when I went to law school, there's an expensive prep test that you take. You just don't walk in and take the LSAT cold. You take the Kaplan prep test, which is expensive. So, what would you say to, that liberal that says, well, black kids or poor kids? They need a hand up because they're not able to pay for, they don't have the privilege to be able to pay for these tests. Their parents can't afford them. What would you say to that?
Uh, I don't think that's an argument that holds up to a lot of scrutiny. One thing you can look at is how low-income children from other racial and ethnic groups do on the test. So, for instance, if you look at what working class, low-income Asians, how they do on the test, they tend to outperform the middle class and upper middle class kids from other groups. I mentioned the schools in New York City, the specialized high schools that use a standardized test. There are 8 of them in New York City, and Asians are way overrepresented among who's admitted on these to these schools each year. I mean, somewhere around half of all the spots go to Asian students, even though Asians are only 12 or 13% of the population in New York City. But the kicker is that among those Asians, they tend to come not from upper income Asian families, but from lower and working class families in New York City. Whereas the black and white kids who get into these specialized schools tend to come from the upper middle or upper income brackets of their populations. So no, I don't think this holds up to scrutiny that poverty is the real issue here. If you go into these Asian communities, what you do see is that there is a focus on learning. It's a cultural issue, I believe, where there's a focus on books, there's a focus on academics. Extra money does go to test prep instead of expensive, clothes or sneakers and so forth. And so it's a cultural issue, and that's something that we need to deal with, that we need to talk about openly. And I think that is often neglected when we talk about the learning gap. We don't talk a lot about cultural issues that go into that gap. It's sort of a taboo subject that some cultures are really into learning and other cultures are not. In the Black community, you sometimes hear about the acting white problem. That raising your hand, being the smartest kid, doing your homework, being studious is looked down upon. You're made fun of for that in many Black communities. That's a problem, and that is a problem that I believe is feeding this academic gap that we see, and it doesn't receive the attention that it deserves.
Yeah, for my jump in time, I'll actually open with a story. Like I think I told Brooks this once at the gym, but one of the bigger fights I got into in high school came because I wore a backpack to school with all my books in it. And I was like a reasonably popular kid, although I'm kind of a nerd. And my buddies started just ragging on me, like, you backpack nerd, what you got that bag on, you little. And I actually ended up getting a fight with one of these guys, and we were punching each other because it struck me as just so ridiculous. Like I was genuinely offended. Like I remember saying, I have my backpack on because this is school, you dumb bastards. And
Yeah.
everyone
Oh, yeah.
seemed to be genuinely conflicted by this. Like, no, no, that's not what we do, dog. You're making us look bad. I mean,
Yeah.
I can't really even do the accent at this point in my life. I'm sadly prepping.
You mentioned an earlier book of mine, Wilfred, Please Stop Helping Us, which is semi-autobiographical. And I believe in that book, I tell a story about going back home to Buffalo, New York, where I was born and raised. Some years after I'd started working as a journalist at the Wall Street Journal, I'd been there for a decade or so. I went back home to see my older sister, who had a couple kids, and I was chatting with her youngest, who was maybe around 7 or 8 years old at the time. We were at their house having dinner, and she had a little girlfriend there from school with her. And I was asking her, what are your favorite subjects, the sort of things, your uncle does at that age. And and she says to me, hey, Uncle Jason, why you talk white? Why you trying to sound so smart? And she turned to to her friend and said the same thing. Why my uncle trying to sound so smart? And I was a little struck at the time, but not really, because it was something I had experienced as a kid, like you, in grade school and high school. The studious kid, the nerdy kid, the kid who was in the honors classes and so forth, was sort of a target, particularly for other black kids. And so but what I had forgotten is how early it starts. This was a 7-year-old. These two little girls, they had just learned how to ride a bike. And they were not only sophisticated enough to notice white sounding language, but to know it was something to be mocked at 8 years old.
Yeah,
I
one of
mean,
the
it
things that
really, really struck me. And that's what I remembered when I was recalling it for the book, is how early this starts, let alone by the time you are in high school or sitting down to take an SAT. This is a cultural issue, and it really does deserve more attention than it receives.
Yeah, and actually, I have a quick question about that, but just a comment first. Like, one of the things that you see if you get into kind of the race and IQ and test scoring debate online or even in the journals is that people will often say, as though this is a great mystery, like very early on in life, the white tested IQ is 100 or something like that, and the black tested IQ is 97. It's very close. And then each year, the black kids fall progressively further behind. And there's often an effort made to try to find some complex genetic or racism based reason for that. One obvious explanation would be you're a small but definite bit behind at first for whatever reason. And so school becomes stereotyped as something the other guy does. And so you start getting ragged for being good at school. I mean, I imagine there'd be many equivalents. A white guy who plays particular sports or is very into hip hop in the 90s or something like this. And so you just stop doing it. I
Mhm.
noticed a lot of middle class black kids put out about a B minus level of effort. They're not going to embarrass themselves. They're going to go to the local college. They might play some ball there, but that's not what an Asian or Bosnian or something family would
Sure.
allow. And this actually leads into the question, which is it, it seems that in the black community, for a lot of people, sure, this Christy, obviously, this isn't cool for, or this isn't true for your kids. This isn't true for a lot of my friends. But very often, being downwardly mobile is seen as being authentically black. So when I no, and I'm not even saying that as a joke, although I suppose it is funny, but like when I see white kids as posers, they're usually posing as rich. It's two polos, collars popped. It's a bit obnoxious, but you can see the reason for it. But I teach at a pretty well-rated historically black college, and you also see the reverse, where like the sons of black dentists will be trying to act like thugs. Like guys will
Mhm.
come to class with ski masks on. That was a
Mhm.
trend until about a year ago. They're known as shiesties after the rapper Pooh Shiesty. And as an older black man, you kind of have a talk with them like, son, you're majoring in chemistry. You're going to go to Dartmouth for grad school. What are you doing? And it gets across, it gets across. But why is that and how do we fix it, I guess?
Part of the
Easy question.
problem, honestly, Wilfred, I think, is that white culture has elevated the black thug as the authentic black person.
White liberals
Um,
are to blame for everything.
oh,
Okay. But it's kind of true. I bring that up every couple episodes.
I don't entirely disagree with you, but in this case, I think it is certainly true that that is what is presented as the authentic black. Um, George Floyd. Think about George Floyd. Maybe this is a slightly extreme example, but not really. George Floyd has been painted as your typical black man in America who has an encounter with police and winds up dead. George Floyd was a career criminal. He was a drug addict. Most black people are not career criminals or drug addicts. I mean, this is it's insane. Yet this man was presented as the poster child for black men. Wilfred, we all leave the house every day, you and I, worried about getting shot by a cop or being killed by a police officer. That is what we are told. That is what we have been told day in and day out for more than a decade now. If you go back to Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin, and so all these people painted as typical black people, particularly typical black men, and it's just not true. Statistically, it is not true. Even anecdotally, it is not true. But this is something that the media has perpetrated for a long, long time. And I mean, I'm sure you've seen these stories of, say, white women who will, write some into some a newspaper advice columnist saying, "Oh, my daughter's dating a black man, and I'm so worried that they'll get pulled over by police." While he's driving the car, and something bad will happen to him. Or white people who say, I'm witnessing a mugging. Actually, I'm the victim. I'm being mugged, but I'm hesitant to call the police because I know they just come and shoot black people. I mean, this is the world we now live in, and it's a world that has been created, I think, by and large. These perceptions have been created by and large by white liberals, and they're not only not true, they're dangerous. They're counterproductive and they're dangerous. But I think that is where a lot of this comes from.
Right. I mean, I think everyone on the panel has some
Yeah.
comments here. Christy, you look like you're about to jump in there. What do you think?
So we know what the problem is with white liberals. We talk a lot about them, but the flip side, and a lot of this is the boomerang effect, but the flip side with conservatives is now everything is DEI. Everyone is DEI. No one is qualified. So, can you kind of speak to the overreaction that we're now experiencing? And a lot of it is the grifter class. I mean, if you spend a lot of time online, I don't even think these people are half serious. But can you kind of speak to the overreaction on the right because of what the liberals have set up?
Well, it could be because of it could be an overreaction, or it just could be human nature. But yes, you do have what you're describing is, every high-ranking black person is a DEI hire. Um, no one who is a minority deserves where they've gotten. They've all been promoted based on political correctness and so forth. Yes, I've said for a long time that that this is the flip side of the Black Lives Matter agenda, and I think the identity politics is bad for whites, it's bad for blacks, and both sides should cut it out. But I don't think that, particularly in the Trump era, frankly, that this identity politics that a lot of black conservatives complain about is unique to white liberals. You do have more and more white conservatives playing in identity politics, tampering, or I should say, dabbling in identity politics, and I think it's just as destructive when they do it. I do not give them any quarter at all. I've been just as critical when the right plays this card as when the left plays this card. I just don't think it has any place in our discussion of public policy, in particular with regard to minorities.
Right. I would tend to agree with that. But Brooks Crenshaw, and I don't mean anything positive or negative by this, but you're a conservative white guy. What do you think about this whole framework? The black community's presentation of authenticity, white liberals amplifying that. I mean, do you have any comments there? Or obviously, any other
So
topic is available as
I
well.
was thinking about this, by pulling back a little bit and historically, across racial and cultural lines, we kind of saw a shift in culture universally. I would say in the, what would you say, the mid to late 50s, with the introduction of the concept cool, right? Which cool kind of translated to unearned social authority, largely aesthetic. And I think that is essentially what's taking place on steroids, in the dynamic that you're describing. I mean, it's counterproductive. It punishes excellence, and it's the crab bucket, right? Get back in the bucket, trying to get out notion. So yeah, I don't really have much to add to that.
That's actually a really
Well,
interesting point you made there, though. Obviously, I want to hear Jason's answer more than me yapping, but I do want to point that out. You pointed out that cool is a relatively new idea. That I hadn't heard anyone say that in a while. That's pretty much correct. Like the idea of the beatnik and the hippie and that having sex as an unmarried woman was sometimes a good thing, or people boasting about their fighting abilities. I'm sure some of that happened in bars and so on. But that occurring at the level of musicals and people writing books like Howl and so on, that had a specific starting point. And there's a study that came out recently that found that people think very different things are good and cool. So women are slightly more attracted to cool, which I thought was funny. I don't really think that surprises anyone. But like good was seen as being stable, affectionate, compassionate. Cool was seen as being aggressive, warlike. There were things like brave that were part of both. But yeah, that idea that the second one is to be praised as well, as opposed to being dismissed as kind of evil and invoked on raiding parties and so on. That's a pretty new idea. Jason, what were you going to say? Look like you're going to respond
Oh,
to.
I was just gonna say, and this gets also back to what Christy was talking about the identity politics. And I get at this in the affirmative action myth book, and also I think in the Supreme Court decision, the Harvard decision, the Chief Justice Roberts touched on this as well, which is how affirmative action feeds into stereotypes, and particularly negative stereotypes about blacks. If you attend one of these elite schools and all the black kids at that school, or most of the black kids, the lion's share, seem to be struggling, seem to be switching to easier majors or dropping out at higher rates than other kids. And then you go on and leave school and enter the professional world. What is your opinion of black people based on your college experience? So yes, this does tend to feed into stereotypes. Brooks, over your left shoulder, I see a photo of Thomas Sowell, and it's the one I used on the cover of my intellectual biography of Sowell that was published a few years ago. But one of the things that Sowell talks about, and it's useful because um, he's from a different generation. He was born in 1930, just turned 95 on June 30th. And uh, one of the things he talks about is growing up in the pre-affirmative action era. Now, obviously, this was Jim Crow as well, but it's also the pre-affirmative action era in which he was someone who had graduated, who he was in graduate school, but he had already graduated from Harvard and Columbia Business School, and was teaching on college campuses in the 1960s when he was well into his 30s. And he talks about how he was received in those jobs and the assumptions made about him in those jobs, which is it's fascinating. And because here he was, this black guy, economist, um, and people assumed if you were a black man with his credentials, you knew your stuff. He was, and but this is the 1960s. He also talks about being in the Marines during the Korean War, and he was a photographer in the Marines, and he was stationed stateside down in the South, Jim Crow South, and he was one of the few people in the photography department in the Marines. And he tells a story about how when people had problems, white Marines had problems with their camera, and they looked at who they could go to in the Photoshop, the Marines, they'd come to him. And his assumption is that they're thinking, there's a black guy over there. He must really know his stuff to be, to have made it to where he is in the Marines and in this department, fixing cameras and taking photos. But that was the assumption. You fast forward to the 1970s, and you look at, say, Justice Thomas's memoir. Justice Thomas is the next generation after Sowell. So he's coming out of law school in the 1970s, out of Yale Law School. He's looking for a job. in the early 1970s on Wall Street, wants to live in New York. But this is now the era of affirmative action. And people are saying, we know how you got into Yale. We know how we know those grades you claim to have. We know how they're handing out grades these days. Seoul didn't have to deal with that.
Now, I
And he
remember
considers himself lucky, but Thomas did, and subsequent generations did. The sort of tainted Black achievement, affirmative action has done that, and so no one trusts the accomplishments that Blacks have made, whether or not they're deserved, and that's one of the problems with affirmative action.
One follow-up there that I think a lot of people are hesitant to ask, but do you feel that the new bias to some extent is justified? I mean, like when you look at the gaps on the SAT between racial groups, whites are only average, by the way. Asians, Jews, so on are ahead. Nigerians, if you break them out, I believe still are, that kind of thing. But it's still nonetheless like it's 950 for blacks, 970 for Hispanics, it's 910 for Native American Indians. And then you move up to whites. Whites are a solid 1110, so 200 points ahead of natives. And then you have Asians at I think 1243. Any of you three might correct that. But when you go to school, you understand that if you're mismatching, if you're going for proportional representation, we've all hired people. That means that there's a between the Asian kid and the native kid, there's a 333-point gap. Black kid and the Asian kid, there's like a 290-point gap. So how could people avoid having those prejudices? I mean, if you go to
Oh, yeah.
my alma mater, Illinois, I mean, the white and Asian kids would be a quarter step below Harvard, 15 something SAT. I mean, the minimum I think to get in, which is what a lot of the minority students have, is about an 1100. So I mean,
Yeah.
that's an enormous gap, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. How do you avoid prejudice in that situation, or do you just
Oh no,
give
you're
that?
you're 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 absolutely right, and I've noticed it anecdotally. I do a fair amount of speaking on college campuses, including at a bunch of elite schools, and oh yeah, you notice it. You notice it, and it's painful. It's painful to give a lecture, start taking questions, and differentiate between the quality of the questions you're being asked based on the racial makeup of who's in the audience. One thing that gives me pause about overgeneralizing, Wilfred, is that, as you know, even at these elite schools, and this is part of the problem with how affirmative action is evaluated, in many of these elite schools, um, they admit Black kids who do meet the standards of the average
Mhm.
student at the school, as well as Black kids who do not. And so, when you're measuring the efficacy of affirmative action or the problems that it is causing, you really do need to differentiate between those two groups. And there have been studies that do that. There was one study done by an economist at Duke University who looked at Blacks who were admitted to Duke University with the same test scores, class rank as the average student at Duke, and those that were not. And the ones that were admitted with the average credentials of the average student at Duke did just fine at Duke. They majored in what they wanted to major in. They went on to graduate. They did just fine. The ones, however, who were admitted with significantly lower credentials struggled. And that is the mismatch problem. And it's not just limited to race. Um, we talk about it in terms of race, but as I've said before, if you admitted, left-handed redheads to Harvard who had SAT scores 300 points below those of the average student at Harvard, you would see left-handed redheads graduating at lower rates, dropping out at higher rates, switching to easier majors more often, and so forth. Just as we see among alumni's children who are admitted, legacies who are admitted with lower test scores, or athletes who are admitted with lower test scores. We talk about affirmative action in terms of race, but the mismatch problem transcends race, and we need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and one thing you said there that's actually extremely interesting. So you're saying that when defenders of affirmative action say, well, black students at these institutions are more than two-thirds as likely to graduate as white students, which I mean still isn't great, but all of that includes the many black students that just got in.
Oh yeah, and that is, by the way, that is one of the major flaws in one of the texts that is often cited to prove that affirmative action works. It's a book called The Shape of the River, written in the 1990s by Derek Bach and William Bowen, who are the heads of Princeton and Harvard. And one of the problems with their study is that they did not differentiate between those black students who had been admitted with the same academic credentials as the average student at these elite schools and those black students who had not been admitted with those credentials, or who had been admitted without those credentials, I should say. And if you're not differentiating, you're not really getting at the core problem with mismatch and the affirmative action. But it's but the other thing, and I should mention this because I think a lot of people who in the general public are just unaware of this. But you hear people talk about Jim Crow and that era as being an era when this country had affirmative action for white people. And so they say, well, now it's our turn. Now it's the turn for blacks. We had a period when there was affirmative action for whites. What's wrong with having affirmative action for blacks for a period of time to help them catch up and so forth? But it's worthwhile to look at what happened to whites under Jim Crow. And if you go back, what you find is that white Southerners were ahead of blacks economically before Jim Crow, and they were ahead of blacks economically after Jim Crow had ended. But during Jim Crow, uh, white Southerners didn't increase their lead. Not only did they not increase their lead over blacks, they didn't close the gap with white Northerners. So affirmative action for white people was not some great economic boon under Jim Crow. And that's a domestic example, but you can look at international examples of this as well. If you go over to Southeast Asia, for example, and look at places like Malaysia, where the Malays are the majority, there are laws in place that limit with the ethnic minorities, the Chinese, can do in terms of the workforce, what kind of jobs they can hold, and in terms of schooling, where they can go to be educated. The ethnic Chinese have, for decades, outperformed the majority Malays, both academically and economically, despite laws being in place to help the majority population, the Malays. So this whole idea that affirmative action is a benefit, whether it's for the majority or the minority, is something that doesn't really hold up to scrutiny when you look at what's happened both here in the U.S. and internationally.
So I had a quick comment. I went to the University of San Diego, and I was the last class that came in, when affirmative action was still in place. They had Prop 209. Now, I never thought about it. I mean, I was always in, honors classes. My SAT was pretty good. I don't know if I got in under affirmative action or not. I'm sure most Black kids, they probably don't know. I mean, unless their test scores are just bad, then they can probably, figure it out. But when I was in college, all of a sudden, they tell you should be upset. They're, dismantling. I didn't even really know what affirmative action was. They're dismantling affirmative action. And then next thing you see, like I have college pictures of Jesse Jackson coming, and I'm sitting there, on the curb, protesting with this blank look on my face. You know what I mean? I'm from a, solidly middle class two-parent household. My parents are still, married to this day. So I think it's like when you're talking about affirmative action, one, it's time. It's time for it to end. because it's not fair to the students who got there legitimately. And also the problem that I saw, I mean, I've always been, one of two, one of a few Black kids in entire schools everywhere I went. So I'm used to it. It honestly doesn't bother me being in white spaces. I don't even think about it. But a lot of people that I went to school with, they really struggled because they weren't used to that. A lot of, Black kids, they struggled, and that could be part of their transferring out or just not making it is the environment. And then being in, La Jolla, which is a mini Beverly Hills, was a whole thing in and of itself too. Now, I did hear you say that the rate did plummet. I think it went from like 8% or 9% when I was there to now it's like 2% of Black kids. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to college. They're just going to the Cal States instead of the, UCs. Kamala Harris went to a Cal State. It's a lesser, ranked school than the UCs, but obviously she did just fine, right? So I think when we're talking about ending affirmative action and where are Black kids going to go, the assumption is, oh, they're going to be disadvantaged because they're not going to go to college at all. That's just total, BS. They'll either go to a school where they're better suited or they'll go into the trades. I mean, nowadays, I think we're re-looking who should even be in college or not.
Yes, yes. And just to start with where you finished, I think we should continue to look at who should be in college and who should not. I'm of the opinion that it's not particularly a popular one, that perhaps too many people are going to college, that a four-year liberal arts degree is not for everyone, that you can earn a very good living without a four-year degree, learning a trade, and then become a very productive person, a very happy person, a very content person, without going to college, and that we should really be focused on making sure that people who can get something out of college can go to college, and not just shoveling bodies, as many bodies as possible, into these four-year universities. But you're right, historically, after Prop 209 passed, you saw a reduction in Black enrollment at the more elite campuses, mainly UC Berkeley and UCLA. But you also saw an increase in Black enrollment at throughout the UC system, UC Santa Cruz, UC Santa Barbara, other schools like that. And that is the mismatch issue. Kids were going to schools where they were better matched with the other students at that school. And again, just to put a fine point on this, one of the most important characteristics about uh, in determining whether a student will be successful at a school is whether their credentials match those of the other people at the institution. When they do match the other people, kids tend to do just fine. And so that's what we saw after Prop 209. But what we also saw, and this is related, is higher Black graduation rates, higher Black graduation rates in the more difficult disciplines, the STEM fields, higher GPAs, and so forth. So, in hindsight, a policy that had been put in place to increase the ranks of the Black middle class had, in practice, resulted in fewer Black doctors and lawyers and engineers than we would have had in the absence of the policy. And you mentioned Kamala Harris. I believe she's a Howard graduate. And what's interesting about the HBCUs is that they don't use affirmative action. And one of the results of them not using affirmative action, I would argue, is they produce a disproportionate number of Black professionals, including in the STEM fields, not only lawyers and judges, but mechanical engineers, scientists, chemists, biologists. They punch well above their weight in producing Black professionals, and they don't use affirmative action. I mean, one of the studies I use in the my most recent book to point this out is one of a comparison of students, black students who had attended Howard University Law School versus black students who had attended George Mason University Law School, which is a higher ranked law school, more selective law school. Because some people argue, well, maybe this black kid doesn't have quite the credentials coming in as the white kid, but they're going to a better school, so they'll do just fine. Well, what this study does was compare passage rates of the bar exam on the first try. And it turns out that something like 57% of the Howard Law School graduates passed the bar on the first try, versus only around 34 or 35% of the black students who went to George Mason University under affirmative action policies. So then you ask yourself, did those black kids who were admitted to George Mason under affirmative action get a better education because they were going to a more selective school? And there have been similar studies done about medical schools as well in terms of admitting black students. So you're right. On the one hand, you could say if affirmative action was going to work, it would have worked by now. We're 50 years into this. But in addition to that problem of it not having worked yet, it looks to be counterproductive. It's not only not working, it's counterproductive in setting up a lot of smart black kids to fail. A lot of these kids that are admitted to Duke or Michigan or Harvard or Yale or so forth under affirmative action policies are black kids that score well above the national average on standardized tests. They're just not scoring as high as their fellow students at Duke and Michigan and so forth. So these are kids who would be hitting it out of the park at a slightly less selective university, and yet they're struggling at a Duke or an MIT or a Michigan. Why? What is the point of flunking out of MIT or flunking out of the University of North Carolina instead of graduating from North Carolina State? Or flunking out of the University of Michigan instead of graduating from Michigan State. What are we trying to do here? So again, to me, that is another example of the shortcomings of these affirmative action policies. That's why I'm not sorry that the Supreme Court decided the way it did, and what took them so long. It's my answer, my question.
Fair enough. All right, Brooks Crenshaw, last question of the core component here. And now one question that I have in mind, you're a working class guy from Kentucky by background, done a lot of impressive things since, but do you have any thoughts on all of this, legacy programs, athletic scholarships, affirmative action, or is there another question you have in mind?
Well, so I, in listening to this, and I've been observing this conversation for a long time. I noted from my own experience a similar experience with regard to veteran hiring in the post 9/11 era, because companies were incentivized to look at that talent pool, but they did not look granularly enough at qualification. They tended to want to hire a veteran for some universal quality, and that experiment did not go well. And as a result, the veteran hire largely became yet another protected class type hire. And so this is just kind of a demonstration that it's partly just the inability for human systems to operate efficiently in the face of perverse incentives. And there's certainly perverse incentives in the university system with regard to enrollment, et cetera. So, that's kind of a parallel to what I'm hearing in this conversation that I experienced personally.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I think it's of a piece what I was saying about affirmative action not being primarily a racial issue. It's about credentials.
Right.
And it's what happens to me when you stray from the sort of meritocracy model that I think is, frankly, obviously it's imperfect. But what is the alternative? Are you going to start, basing promotions or hiring on patriotism with respect to veterans, nepotism, the old boys network, and that's, I think you just run into complications. I think meritocracy is the best of the
Trade-off.
bad choices
Right.
that we have in terms of a universal standard. But I think the veteran example is of a piece with that, certainly.
And as a right-leaning businessman, although not at my most formal right now, I'd actually say to some of the people that I know are in the audience, this is something for the right to keep in mind. I mean, we're now seeing people like Ron DeSantis reshaping entire educational systems. You probably don't want to just hire the best far-right conservatives or the best evangelicals or something like that. Might sometimes be necessary, but the goal should always be to have the best people, not the best black, female, conservative, veteran, who's on the board, because even no matter which group is 10% ahead in the sprint race at a given time, when you do that, you're limiting yourself to 5 or 10 or whatever percent of the pool. How many black, female, conservative veterans are there? So on that note, we always close with a last word of wisdom. Um, I guess I'll go first. I don't think I have more wisdom than anyone else on the panel. So then we'll go to the other panelists and the guest will close it out. But I mean, I guess my comment would be, to me, as someone who's pretty highly intelligent without false modesty and who also comes from a working class area, a lot of what we're doing with the colleges seems almost ridiculous and just like a way, as Brooks said, to get bodies in the seat. So when I look at my alma mater, University of Illinois, that's a very typical like top second tier school. I think last I looked, about 52% of people actually get in. The rest would be affirmative action admits, legacy admits, athletes. That's like 15% of a Big Ten or what used to be Pac-10 school. The children, I forget the acronym, but the children of staff, professors, coaches, and so on. So by the time you get through all of that at a reasonably selective school, you have a really squeezed group of white and Asian middle class kids that are really good. And everyone else, wealthy kids, athletes, many of the minorities are just sort of there. They're not bad, but that's half the student body, and it strikes me that you could pretty easily improve the school by either cutting the population size in half, or even better, by just selecting everyone using the same kind of rigorous techniques. So be colorblind, treat everyone equally. That's my word of wisdom. Brooks Crenshaw, you got a word of wisdom?
So I wanted to tack on to the previous conversation a quick anecdote. If somebody can confirm this, I've heard it in passing, and I wanted to confirm if it was true regarding Clarence Thomas and his Yale diploma. He was eating his lunch at his desk, and he had a pie that had I believe it was a 39-cent sticker on it for the price tag for the pie. And post affirmative action, he slapped that on his Yale diploma and said that is now what that's worth because of the image that will be portrayed. Anybody heard that one?
It's a true
I
story.
haven't heard that one.
I contributed something original. Wonderful. Well, I'll look that up and make sure.
Always do. But that's in Clarence Thomas's book. And I mean, I forget whether it was Illinois he spoke of. It was one of the Big Tens that a bunch of people went. And yeah, he openly tells that story. He says, I got in, and I mean, you told it at least as well, but I got in, I was eating lunch, I was eating a chicken pot pie. I had the sticker for 39 cents. It's not worth nothing, but it's not worth much. And I put it on the college degree because if we're going to hire based on race and alma mater and all this other, I mean, this could be any one of 15. People think I'm underperforming. So yeah, it's an interesting Thomason story. All right, Christy Kelly, what do you? Yeah. Sorry, Brooks, you going on?
No, really, just the point that you made, Jason, that I think is the most pertinent to the conversation is that these are largely failures of human incentive with regard to perverse incentive and a failure to adhere to first principles, like there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And so viewing it from that lens takes a lot of the heat out of it. And I think that's the best conversation to be had.
A tip that Jason had actually is that if you're going to use race stats, this is our last event together, but just compare Asians and Hispanics, because for some reason no one gets mad. It's not like and then I recall that was you, Jay. It was definitely someone in the crowd, but it's just sort of, it's not blacks versus whites and natives. It's not any groups of people that have killed each other in the past. It's just the same gaps there. So how many Hispanic students are you going to let in? How many Asians? Christy Kelly, what do you think? Word of wisdom.
Yeah, we talked about how do we change the culture in Black America? How do we have the conversation that I would just say Americans in general need to value, education, two-parent households, studying, get off the PlayStation, get off the TV, just the values that are going to get us to value education versus the rapper and the sports. We have heard this before, most recently, Christmas. I don't know if you were online, Christmas Day, when, the internet blew up because Vivek Ramaswamy was, and Elon to some extent, was having this conversation. And people in the right wing are still pissed at Vivek because he said American culture to some extent. He didn't use the word lazy, but just I'll use the word lazy because it's short, right? America, the culture needs to change. So we have had this. We even Cosby used to say it, right? Even Obama used to say it to some extent. That the issue is who is going to be able to say it to get people to listen. So I think until we start having the entertainer class or, God forbid the rap class or the sports people, wake up, Black America is in trouble and we need you to start saying, this is what's important to change the culture.
That's a great last comment. And yeah, I was when you started saying that, I was thinking of Vivek, who said if you read the series of tweets, he said a lot of stuff like stop idolizing the homecoming king, stop watching porn, and people just started throwing pies at him. Just like the comments were like, "How dare you, you foreign SOB!" It was just all the most wholesome stuff imaginable. Like, I'm an immigrant dad. You guys are really letting down the women. Go to school. Just anyway, he is not yet recovered, and he's not disowning it during his Ohio campaign. But he ain't bringing it up either. Jason Reilly, last word to our honored guest. What do you have to say, sir?
Well, I would agree with Chrissy's comment. The point you're making goes back many years, decades. This is what Daniel Patrick Moynihan got in trouble for saying about the breakdown of the Black family that he noticed in an academic study in the 1960s, and he caught hell for saying that you know single parent homes do not bode well for a group. And Moynihan was someone who was speaking from experience. His father was an alcoholic who had abandoned the family. And so he knew firsthand what it was like to grow up with an absent father. And when he looked at the data, by the way, that had been gathered by a lot of Black sociologists like E. Franklin Frazier, um, St. Clair, you know, uh, uh, and again, St. Clair Drake and others, and uh, what happened to him, I think, scared off a lot of academics, particularly a lot of sociologists, from even studying the effects of breakdown of the Black family for many years, or at least reporting what they knew about it, honestly, and instead steering clear of that. There was a woman a couple years ago named Melissa Carney, an economist, who wrote a book called The Two-Parent Privilege. And it was a very commonsensical book, just laying out the facts and the data on all the advantages that come to a child from being from a two-parent home. And she said that when she was working on this book, in the circles she ran in, the academic circles, uh, they were discouraging her from writing about her findings, saying, you know, we should be talking about what the government should be doing for single parent families, whether we're spending enough on welfare, whether we're spending enough on this or that, but we should not be critiquing the makeup, the family makeup. And so she was not even, she was discouraged from even talking about how family makeup can have a huge impact on income inequality. Uh, so, and this again, this is 2023, 2024. These are still taboo conversations out there, even though they are very commonsensical. And so, one of the reasons that Black America uh, was making such tremendous gains in the pre-affirmative action era in the 1940s and 50s and early 60s is because you did have more Black intact families. You did have marriage rates in the Black community that were equal or above those of white America. There was a focus on academic achievement. There was an attitude among Blacks, and particularly the Black civil rights leadership, that Black people must succeed notwithstanding Jim Crow, notwithstanding racism. Whereas today, the Black leadership says, until racism has been eliminated, vanquished from America, don't talk to me about Black responsibility. An earlier era of Black leaders had exactly the opposite attitude. And I think that had a tremendous amount to do with the Black progress that we saw in the pre-affirmative action era. And so I think there's a lot to be learned from that era. It's looked down upon today as respectability politics, but I think there was something to respectability politics. They produced the Brown versus Board of Education decision. They produced the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. There's something to be said about respectability politics and Black advancement. And so I would not dismiss it out of hand. And that's what I'll leave you with.
Boom. That's a great ending point, that being respectable, performing well, and studying is likely to bring you more advantage in life than revolutionary poetry. Thanks to Jason Reilly for coming on, as always, with Christy Kelly, Brooks Crenshaw. I'm Will Reilly, signing out for the night.
Country to say, Patriot J, I'm saving the day. Patriot J, I'm saving the day from you commies who lame. No, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to say. God bless the US of A, land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.